Hello everyone. So today we will discuss about deadlock handling. So first of all, what is deadlock and what situation is known as deadlock situation? So a deadlock is a situation where two or more transactions are waiting continuously for one another to give up their locks. Deadlock is said to be one of the most feared complications in DBMS because no transaction ever gets finished and are in waiting state forever. This brings the whole system to a halt. So this is known as deadlock situation. Here we have example of deadlock situation. We have two transaction T1 and T2. T1 transaction holds the lock for student table and T2 transaction holds the lock for grade table. Now transaction T1 is requesting to release the lock because T1 wants to update the row in grade table and T2 wants to release the lock because T2 wants to update the row in student table. So in this situation, neither T1 nor T2 will release their locks. So it will bring a whole system to a halt and no transaction will execute completely. So this is the situation we call deadlock. Now for deadlock handling we have three types of approaches: deadlock avoidance, deadlock prevention and deadlock detection. So in deadlock avoidance, when a database is stuck in a deadlock, it is always better to avoid the deadlock rather than restarting or aborting the database. Now if transaction T1 simply waits for transaction T2 to release the lock on grade table before it begins. When transaction T2 release the lock, transaction T1 can proceed freely. This is the method of avoidance, that one transaction has to release the lock and one transaction has to wait and then proceed further when locks are released. Now second we have deadlock prevention. In deadlock prevention method, this is suitable for large database if the resources are allocated in such a way that deadlock never occurs, then the deadlock can be prevented. The DBMS analyzes the operations of the transaction whether they can create a deadlock situation or not. If they do, then the DBMS never allowed that transaction to be executed. Deadlock prevention mechanism proposes two schemes for deadlock prevention. First one is wait and die scheme. In this scheme, if a transaction requests for a resource which is already held with the conflicting lock by another transaction, then the DBMS simply checks the timestamp of both transactions and it allows the older transaction to wait until the resource is available for executions. For example, if transaction T1 entered at the system at 5th second, so it will allow the older transaction to wait until the resource is available. So this is wait and die scheme, and the another one is wound and wait scheme. In wound and wait scheme, if the older transaction requests for a resource which is held by the younger transaction, then the older transaction forces younger one to kill the transaction and release the resource. After a minute delay, the younger transaction is restarted but with the same timestamp. If the older transaction has held a resource which is requested by younger transaction, then the younger transaction is asked to wait until older releases it. So with the both schemes we can prevent deadlock situation. And if the deadlock occurs, we have the third option, deadlock detection. When a transaction waits indefinitely to obtain a lock, the database management system should detect whether the transaction is involved in a deadlock or not. Here is we have a graph. Wait for graph is one of the method for detecting the deadlock situation. This method is suitable for smaller database. In this method, the graph is drawn based on the transaction and the lock on the resource. If the graph is created has a closed loop or a cycle, then there is a deadlock. So this is a method to detect the deadlock condition, that if the transaction forms a loop and cycle, so we can say that there is a deadlock. And if there is a deadlock, we can prevent the deadlock by the two scheme, wet and die and wound wait schemes.